We are, of course, covering this evening the final period of the history of Israel and Judah. And it is a time that there are a lot of parallels, a lot of things that certainly parallel to our time today. Now, if you noted last Bible study, we came down basically to the end of the life of Jehoshaphat, the end of the life of Ahab, and this time period. Now, the 8th century BC was a time period that witnessed the emergence in Israel and Judah of a commercial civilization of great material prosperity. The commercial civilization that began to take place in Israel and Judah reached a height as far as material prosperity. There's some interesting comments in the Sonsino commentary, which is the Jewish commentary on the Old Testament. And in their commentary on the book of Micah, they bring out the fact that the 8th century did witness the emergence in Israel and Judah of a commercial civilization of great material prosperity. Foundations were laid in the peace and security which Jeroboam II, now I'm going to refer to these kings. You can look at your chart if you want to follow along on this, otherwise you'll get lost with the names of all these kings. On the far right-hand side of your chart is the kings of Israel. You'll notice Jeroboam II that is written out there and towards the bottom. And contemporary with him was Uzziah of Judah. Well, the lengthy reigns of Jeroboam II and Uzziah won for Israel and Judah respectively a time of peace and security. They won the extension of the borders of their kingdoms from Damascus to the Red Sea and from the desert to the Mediterranean. This gave the Hebrew states command of all of the major trade routes of ancient days. Everything that came across through from Mesopotamia across to Egypt, the Hebrew states were sitting astride of the major trade routes. It was, however, a civilization that displayed all the evils of a society making haste to be rich. Extremes of wealth and poverty, which had been impossible in an agricultural society based on the biblical system of land tenure, became everywhere evident. The pursuit of commerce encouraged the development of cities and city life. With the exchange of goods went the exchange of ideas. New religious cults, standards of luxury and splendor, and materialistic aims of living which had hitherto been foreign to Israel were introduced from Assyria and Egypt. Now, I was reading you a paraphrase from the Sonsino commentary's introduction to the book of Micah. Their description of the 8th century and what it saw as far as the historic development of Israel and Judah could have been said about 20th century United States. You see, in the 20th century, this country went from a primarily agricultural nation to an industrial commercial nation. We went from an agricultural rural nation to an urban nation. We have seen, as a result of that, the change and the transformation in society. We have seen extremes of wealth and poverty, right on down to many of the things that confront us today that are characteristic of an urban society, of a commercial society, in a way that they do not characterize, those extremes do not characterize a primarily agricultural society. Now, I bring out that parallel because when you read the history of 8th century Israel and Judah, you are reading what seems like the history of 20th century America and Britain. Now, understand, it's in the 8th century. If you look out here on your chart, Which prophets were during the 8th century? Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Isaiah down toward the end of it. You're looking at the primary, some of the primary prophets who wrote books of prophecy were writing during that time. In other words, their society, they had a message for their society, but it had implications for our society today. That's why God preserved the message. Now, the reason why the message for that society had parallels and has implications for our society today is because our societies parallel. They were societies that had the same problems. And as a result, they're going to have the same conclusions. Events began to develop rapidly about 60 years before the collapse of Israel. It was during this time that God's work of warning the people to repent reached a peak. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Isaiah, all prophesied during this time period, the final 60 years of the history of northern Israel. Notice that as time came, that leading up to the time of God's intervention, God's punishment, the captivity that God allowed to come on the nation Israel, that what led up to that was the greatest period of prophetic activity in the history of Old Testament Israel and Judah. The most concentrated dosage of prophetic activity took place at that time. And God had a warning and a witness go out. There's a parallel of what Israel went through at this time that certainly parallels what is happening to the United States during the 20th century. Now let's take note of the story. We will pick it up in 2 Kings chapter 3. In 2 Kings chapter 3, this is right after Elijah's ascension in the whirlwind. We find that Jehoram, the son of Ahab, began to reign over Israel in Samaria. And now, if you have your chart, you notice on here Jehoram began to reign. Ahaziah had succeeded Ahab, and then Jehoram very quickly succeeded him. And God was not pleased with him. God was not pleased with anything that came from Ahab and Jezebel. He was not quite as bad as his father and his mother. He did put away the image of Baal, but he continued to follow the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. There was problems. There was strife, and so there were difficulties. Now, right after Ahab's death, the Moabites had rebelled, and Jehoram again was going to succor good old Jehoshaphat. You remember Jehoshaphat, a nice guy, always willing to do a favor for somebody. Well, Jehoram said, "Hey, Jehoshaphat, since Dad died, the Moabites have rebelled against me. Why don't you send an army and come help me out?" And old Jehoshaphat said, "Well, I am as you are, boy. My people is your people. My horses are your horses. Boy, anything I've got you can have. I'll give you the shirt off my back." Sometimes you meet people this way. They're nice people. They're just a little bit gullible and easily taken advantage of. They're so obliging that it's very difficult for them to say no, and they get themselves in some jams. Jehoshaphat was somewhat that way. When again Jehoshaphat, he honored and respected God. Before they went out to battle, he wanted to know if there was a prophet of God they could inquire of. So he was told that Elisha was there. And Elisha told, verse 13, said to the king of Israel, he says, what have I got to do with you? What are you here listening for? Why don't you go to your mother's prophets or your father's? I don't have anything to tell you. You might as well go and get Jezebel's prophets. I don't have any use for you. In verse 14, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, surely were it not that I regard the presence of Jehoshaphat the king of Judah, I would not look toward you nor see you. I wouldn't even have, I wouldn't so much as give you the time of day, Elisha told him, if it weren't that I have respect for Jehoshaphat the king of Judah. Out of respect to him, I'll answer the question. But if it were you asking Jehoram, I wouldn't tell you the time. So, anyway, you go on through the story. We find in chapter 4, it's an account of a miracle that took place, where several miracles that took place showing what Elisha did. We see in the first 7 verses of chapter 4 where Elisha performed a miracle to allow an indebted widow to pay off her creditors. The oil multiplied and she was able to sell it and earn money. She said, I don't have any money and the creditors are at my gate. And Elisha said, look, he says, you got anything, what do you have? And she says, all I've got is a little oil. And he says, I want you to borrow pots, pans, get everything you can rake and scrape that will hold oil, get everything that the neighbors have. Everything you can borrow, get. And then start pouring oil. And she started pouring oil, and the oil kept pouring and pouring and pouring until she filled up every pot and pan and can that she had and everything that any neighbor had and everything around. And when she ran out of pots, well, she ran out of oil. And then she sold the oil and paid off the debt. So God has all kinds of ways of providing things. As we continue on here in chapter, we find here the story we continue on in chapter 4 of the woman that befriended elderly couple that befriended Elisha and the child that they had as a result of God's special blessing, the subsequent death, and then the miracle that Elisha performed of restoring the child to life. In chapter 5, we have an interesting story of Naaman, who was the captain of the host of the king of Syria. Now, the Syrians had raided Israel at various times. They had taken away a number of various Israelites captive, and there was a little servant girl, a little girl that had been taken away, that was a servant in the household of Naaman, who was an Israelite. Naaman was a great favorite of the king of Syria. He was the captain of the host, but Naaman came down with a dread disease, came down with leprosy, for which there was no known cure. This little girl told Naaman, one day when this had come up, she said, I wish you were down in Israel because there's a prophet in Israel that I know could cure you. Well, Naaman was willing to try anything, so he went and talked to the king of Syria. The king of Syria gave him a letter, and he addressed this letter to the king of Israel. And he said, I'm sending my favorite servant down there, I understand you've got somebody that can cure him of leprosy, and I want you to take care of it as a favor to me. Well, needless to say, when the king of Israel got this scared him to death. He said, that guy's trying to pick a fight with me. Here he's sending this general down here that's got leprosy, and he expects me to cure him? What am I going to do with him? I can't cure him. He's sending him down here and expecting me to do something. Well, when Elisha heard about it, he was somewhat irate. Elisha sent word to the king. He said, let him come to me. Verse 8 of 2 Kings 5. and he shall know that there's a prophet in Israel. You know, you may not have any faith, but evidently the Syrians have more faith than you do because they sent this guy down here to get cured. You're standing over there wringing your hands and figure that it's impossible. And the Syrians, who have no knowledge of the true God, at least they had enough faith to give it a try. They were told, you know, this little girl, this little servant girl, had far more faith and understanding than this king. Because she said, I know I know God can heal you. And he's got a servant, a prophet down in Israel. So Elisha, when Naaman came there to Elisha's house, Elisha didn't even come out. He sent his messenger out, and he instructed Naaman to go and wash in the Jordan 7 times. Now, Naaman immediately became very upset, very irate. You know why he was irate? Because God didn't do it the way he expected it to be done. You know, look what he said. Naaman was wroth. He said, I thought. See, he had already figured it out. Have you ever jumped to conclusions in your mind? Have you ever kind of figured out how you thought God was going to do it? He said, I thought this man was going to come out here, and I thought that he would call upon the name of his God. You know, there'd be a bunch of big hoopla, and he'd come out here and make a great ceremony and go on, and you know, it'd be something impressive. This leprosy would disappear. He sent his servant out here and told me to go down and wash in that old muddy Jordan River 7 times. What good's that going to do? I got a whole lot better rivers than that back where I come from. I don't need to wash in the Jordan. Boy, you know, I'm insulted. And his servant said to him, he said, look, if the prophet had given you some hard, difficult, terrible task to perform, you know, some great, arduous, difficult task, and said, if you'll perform this, you'll be healed. He said, wouldn't you have gone and done it? Well, yeah. He said, all he asked you to do was something simple. Well, why don't you try it? What can you lose? Well, he went down and he washed in the Jordan 7 times, and you guessed it, he was totally healed. Why? It was an act of faith. It was an act of obedience. What difference does it make whether you wash in the Jordan or whether you go back and wash in a river in Syria? Well, the difference it makes is that God said it made a difference to him. God said wash in the Jordan. He didn't say go back and wash in you know, the Tigris or the Euphrates or anything else. He said wash in the Jordan. You know, what difference does it make? Well, the difference is whether you're doing what God said or not. That's the difference. You know, it's like, what difference does it make whether you keep Sunday or Saturday, just as long as you keep a day? What difference does it make on any number of things? What difference does anything make? The question, brethren, is does it make a difference to God? See, that's the question. People look at it and they say, well, I don't see what difference it makes. Of course they don't see what difference it makes. Naaman didn't see what difference it made whether he washed in the Jordan. But I'll guarantee you no other river would have washed him clean. Not because of any magic quality inherent in the Jordan River, but because he did what God said. Now, there's an important lesson here. Number one, God answered, but he didn't do it the way Naaman expected. In fact, Naaman was so tuned in on looking for an answer coming from a particular direction that he was all upset and almost didn't recognize the answer when it came because God didn't do it the way he had expected. You know, do we put limitations on God sometimes? We get God all figured out and kind of stick him in a box where we've got it all figured out exactly how God's got to do this. And if for some reason or another God doesn't do it the way we expect, well, we think, well, you know, what is this? You know, God slipped up somehow. He didn't get it right. No, God got it right. God did it the way he chose to do it. Now, Naaman came back, and you know what he was going to do? He wanted to, he wanted to pay Elisha for what he had done. You know what Elisha did? He did the same thing that God's servants down through the centuries had done. He said, no, we don't charge for what we do. That's quite a contrast to certain churches, some of you come out of, who charge for everything. They'll charge you to pray for you, much less, charge you for all kinds of things. That's not God's way. Christ said, freely you've received, freely give. Elisha would not accept payment. And then, of course, the servant of Elisha, boy, his eyes got big when he saw all that money, and he decided that maybe if Elisha didn't want it, he would take it. And that proved to be a very fatal mistake on his part. That was a very serious matter. That's something that should not be looked at in a light way. Well, as we come on, we find in chapter 6, we find a further story of another miracle that Elisha performed, other miracles, and in 2 Kings 6, in verse 14, the king of Syria was going to send an army to get Elisha. Told that Elisha was in Dothan. He was going to send an army down there to get him. And you, again, remember the story where the servant of God, or the servant of Elisha, came out early that morning, came running back in the house and said, "Alas, my master, what shall we do? We're surrounded." And Elisha said, "No problem. There are more with us than there are with them." And the servant said, "You hadn't looked outside yet. You're sitting in here in the house. You haven't looked out the door. What do you mean there are more with us than there are with them? And there's one, two with us. They've got us surrounded." And Elisha prayed and asked God to perform a miracle to open this servant's eyes to allow him to actually see the spirit realm. And you know what he saw? He saw all of the mountains round about covered with horses and chariots of fire. That's a whole lot more impressive than anything the Syrians had. I think that there are times that we would be absolutely shocked and amazed if our eyes could be opened in that way, and for a brief few moments we had a glimpse of the spirit realm. Elisha had a reaction and a response of faith because he knew God, and he walked with God, and he knew God's power, and he trusted God. And so he was not just overcome with fear and hand-wringing, because he knew that he was the servant of the Most High God. Well, as we come on down a little later in 2 Kings 6, we see that the Syrians had besieged Samaria. There was a great famine, right on down to the point that it came to literal cannibalism. And, the king was very quick to want to blame it all on Elisha. He said, "Boy, I'm going to chop Elisha's head off. He's gotten us into all of this." And verse 32, Elisha sat in his house, and the elders sat with him, and the king sent a man from before him. But before the messenger came to him, he said to the elders, "You see how this son of a murderer has sent to take away my head?" That's what Elisha referred to this son of Ahab and Jezebel as, this son of a murderer. His messenger's coming at the door, and they're coming. So anyway, there was a miracle performed. The Syrian army was wiped out, and all of their provisions fell to Israel. But you notice the attitude. See, blame the problems on God's prophet, on God's servants. Now, I would like to call your attention to something. We had discussed last time the matter of Elijah being carried away in a whirlwind, and that he was taken up into not the third heaven of God's abode, not the second heaven of outer space, but the first heaven of the earth's atmosphere, of the clouds, of the birds. That's where a whirlwind would normally go. He was taken up, removed away, sat down somewhere else. and continued to live for a period of time. We're not told how long. Notice additional proof of that Elijah's life was not ended at that time. He continued to live here on the earth. We noted in 2 Kings 3 that in verse 1 that Jehoram, the son of Ahab, began to reign over Israel in Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat. And he reigned 12 years. Jehoshaphat was still king of Judah after the time that Elijah was taken up and Elisha had succeeded as God's chief prophet. We saw that on down a little bit further in 2 Kings 3 as we came on down, that Jehoshaphat was still the king of Judah at the time when Elisha had taken over as God's chief prophet. Now, let's take note of that and turn back to 2 Chronicles 21. In 2 Chronicles 21, Jehoshaphat died in verse 1, and his son Jehoram reigned in his stead. Now, this is one of the reasons you need the chart, because what you will find is at this particular time in history, the kings of Israel and Judah had basically the same names, which serves to confuse things more than they're already confused. In most people's minds, they're already confused, and when you have all the kings with the same names, it gets even more confusing. So you can consult the chart here. If you want to make it even more confusing, they were all kin to one another. And would you like the exact family relationships? It gets you get really confused here in just a moment. Anyway, Jehoshaphat died, and his son Jehoram reigned in his stead. And Jehoram, verse 5, was 32 when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years. And notice what happened in verse 12. There came a writing to him, to Jehoram. See, because in verse 6, verse 5, Jehoram was 32 when he began to reign. He reigned 8 years. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, like as had the house of Ahab. He married Ahab's daughter. Jehoram, the king of Judah, married the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, which made him the brother-in-law to Jehoram, king of Israel. So you had Jehoram, king of Israel, whose sister was married to Jehoram, king of Judah. So that was confusing, but evidently not overly so. How many times, in the families that we have, do people have similar names? We have to define them or delineate them in some way. Well, Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, Jehoram married the daughter of Ahab. And he did evil in God's sight. And notice in verse 12, there came a writing to him from Elijah. Not Elisha, but Elijah. Elijah had been taken up in the whirlwind years before. Here comes a writing to Jehoram from Elijah the prophet saying, "Thus says the Lord God of David your father, because you've not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat your father, nor in the ways of Asa king of Judah, but you've walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. You've made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to go a-whoring, like to the whoredoms of the house of Ahab, and you've done all these things. Here's what's going to happen to you." So, here we're shown, there's either this was the original airmail, if Elijah was where most people think he was, this letter had a long trip to get there. It was, definitely the original airmail, which it was not, or Elijah was simply somewhere else. He was taken up, removed. The work that God had for him to do there was completed. What did he do in the remainder of his life? Well, the only insight we're given was God used him to deal with at least this king. Perhaps God used him to go to other kings. We don't know exactly what God had for him. But I would call your attention to that. Now we come to the conclusion of the dynasty of Ahab. God doesn't have a lot good to say about Ahab. And In chapter 9 of 2 Kings, we find that a man by the name of Jehu is told that he has as his destiny to wipe out the dynasty of Ahab. Now, if you'll look on the chart under the kings of Israel, you'll find that Jehu took over. He ended the dynasty of Ahab, and he was going to do this. How did God cut off the dynasty? Well, we find here the story of how Jehu wiped out all of Ahab's dynasty in Israel, as well as all of the priests of Baal, and he made himself king. We find this story in 2 Kings 9 and 10. We find here that Jehu was on his way. Let me call your attention to something about Jehu. In verse 20 of 2 Kings 9, Jehu was famous for something. He was famous for his style of driving. He drove furiously. Verse 20 of 2 Kings 9, the watchman was standing there on the city gate, on the city wall, and he says he saw some dust, and he said, he comes, and the driving is like the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously. Boy, all they could see was this dust churning up. And the watchman said, I can't tell who it is, but it must be Jehu. I can't see anybody, but there's nobody around here that drives like that. Boy, he's coming, wheeling that chariot around the corner on one wheel with all of the dust churning up. And so Jehoram said, make ready. Boy, you better get out of the way. Here comes Jehu. Comes skidding in to a stop. And so Jehoram was going to go out there to meet him. And when Jehoram saw Jehu, verse 22, he said, is it peace? And Jehu said, what peace, as long as the whoredoms of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many? Jehu, verse 24, drew a bow, and he shot Jehoram and killed him. Came on into town. And we find in verse 30 that dear Jezebel is still up to her old tricks. Verse 30, Jehu was come to Jezreel. Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her face and tied her head and looked out at the window. Now, Jezebel is one of these outstanding characters. We find a little bit about her in verse 22. Notice what she is noted for. The whoredoms of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts. The Jezebel, God used Jezebel, Queen Jezebel, as literally the personification of everything. Jezebel personified everything God hates in a woman. In fact, he uses her as a type of the great whore of Revelation 17. You remember, the great whore is described as committing fornication with the kings of the earth, making all nations drunk with the wine of her fornication. That's what Jezebel did literally. She wielded power by committing fornication with the kings of all of the surrounding areas. The whoredoms of Jezebel. She practiced whoredom. She committed whoredom with the kings of the earth. God used her as a type. In fact, if you go back to Revelation 2 and 3, you find that God describes the false church under the person of Jezebel. He tells the Thyatira era, I have somewhat against you because you permit that woman Jezebel. This was the church during the Middle Ages, to seduce my servants. And the reference, of course, was to the Catholic Church, which is personified as Jezebel. Revelation 17 uses the personification of a woman, a queen, who commits fornication with the kings of the earth. And who wields power by entering into illicit relationships with various kings. That's the way she wielded her power. That's the way Jezebel did. Jezebel absolutely personified everything God hates in a woman. And He uses her as a type of that throughout the book of Revelation. She is, Jezebel, we've all heard the term, and Jezebel has, if you refer to, even just terms that we grew up with and heard around, you never took it as a compliment if somebody called you a Jezebel. Did you? If you knew anything about the Bible, you knew that that's not what you wanted to be called. You did not want to be called a Jezebel. Well, God doesn't have a lot good to say about Jezebel. In fact, Jezebel evidently considered herself a great beauty and must have been considered so by the various kings around, because they all wanted to commit fornication with her. And she was getting all decked out for Jehu. But Jehu told the servants, he said, throw her down. And so they picked her up and heaved her out of the window, and she fell down. And of course killed her, died. Very gruesome thing. They went inside and ate, and then decided, Jehu said in verse 34, go and see to this cursed woman and bury her. And when they went to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands, because the dogs had eaten the flesh of Jezebel. A very gruesome, gory conclusion. A very ugly ending. Very gruesome. I think that it serves to show, that God singled her out for an especially gruesome conclusion. Here is a woman who was concerned with, her concern was with outward beauty, and God's concern was with inward beauty. Jezebel may have looked good on the outside. Evidently, the kings of the earth thought so. But as far as God was concerned, she was a very ugly person, because in terms of her character and everything that she represented, and she came to a very gruesome, very ugly end. So it again, given a little bit of insight here in as we go through these accounts of various ones that are focused on and the influence that different ones had. Now, Jezebel's influence continued because her daughter Athaliah had married Jehoram, the king of Judah. So Jezebel's daughter, who was somewhat of a chip off the old block, was down in Judah as the queen down there. Even though Jezebel was dead, Jehu had Ahab's 70 sons killed, and it was just a real bloodletting that you read the story here. And he got rid, in chapter 10, verse 26, of the images in the house of Baal, destroyed Baal worship, but clung to the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. All right. Jehu, we're told in verse 36 of 2 Kings 10, reigned over Israel and Samaria 28 years. Now, in the meantime, in Judah, the Jehoram, the king of Judah, had died, and his son Ahaziah had become king. Ahaziah was the son of Jehoram and Athaliah. Now, Ahaziah died. Ahaziah was, that would have made him the grandson of Jezebel, of Ahab and Jezebel. See, because of intermarriage, the family of Ahab and Jezebel was ruling in Judah as well as in Israel. Well, they were wiped out in Israel. All of them were killed. Now, the grandson, Ahaziah, died. Well, when he did, Athaliah decided that she would be queen. And she was going to murder all of her grandchildren. Nice woman. Real chip off the old block of dear mother. And so she rose up and destroyed all of the royal seed. But there was one little boy, Joash, the son of Ahaziah, who was taken as an infant and was hidden in the temple for 6 years. And Athaliah reigned over the land. And in the 7th year, the high priest called in the leaders and said, all right, enough is enough. The rightful heir to the throne of David is now 7 years old. We're going to bring him out and coronate him, and we're going to get rid of this wicked woman. So he placed the guards in strategic places, and Jehoiada the priest then brought in little Joash. And they brought him, in verse 21, they brought forth the king's son, this is Joash, and put the crown upon him, and gave him the testimony, and they made him king, and they anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, God save the king. Now when Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she came to the temple. And when she looked, behold, the king stood by a pillar as the manner was, or stood on the pillar. If you'll check it in some of the other translations, stood on the pillar as the manner was. You know what this is describing? You'll find this referred to in several occasions where coronations of kings are described. The kings and queens of the house of David are still crowned on the same pillar. On the same pillar. Jacob's pillar stone, which was taken through the wilderness, was taken down into Egypt, was brought back out by the Israelites at the time of the Exodus, journeyed with them through the wilderness, was the pillar of testimony, was set up. The kings were crowned, were coronated on that pillar. When Athaliah came in and saw Joash standing on the pillar as the manner was, she knew what had happened. It was he had been coronated. When she saw this child standing on the pillar, she recognized the pillar. She knew that he had been coronated, and she rent her clothes and cried, treason, treason. Well, she was the one guilty of treason. She was taken out of the temple and executed. Of course, the pillar, Jacob's pillar stone, is to this very day, the present queen, Queen Elizabeth, was coronated sitting on that pillar stone. And, if you've ever been to Westminster Abbey, you can see that pillar stone there under the throne. That ancient pillar that is still the symbol of the throne upon which the kings are coronated. There was a sign there identifying as Jacob's pillar. There's a picture of that in the older edition, the book-length edition of the United States and Britain in Prophecy. Okay, Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. Now, as we come on down, we find that we have the story of Elisha's death in 2 Kings 13, verse 14. Elisha was fallen sick of his sickness, whereof he died. Just call that to your attention. Elisha got sick and he died. He was evidently an elderly man. It was not a matter that Elisha lacked faith. God used Elisha to perform some of the most tremendous miracles of the Bible. But God has designed this physical life to be temporary. So the time came when Elisha got sick and he died, as it's appointed unto all men once to die. Well, in chapter 14, we pick up the story of following the death of Joash. We come down and pick up the story of Azariah or Uzziah. Azariah is the name that is by which he's referred here in 2 Kings 14:21. He's also known as Uzziah. He reigned for 41 years. According to the word of Jonah, God's prophet, this is contemporary with the prophet Jonah. This was a time when Israel and Judah reached their height of power. They expanded, they reached their height of commercial prosperity during the time of Uzziah, the king of Judah, and Jeroboam, the second king of Israel. But economic height, material height, commercial heights, and heights of morality and ethics and righteousness are two totally different things. The nation prospered materially, but the nation degenerated and deteriorated spiritually. Well, what we see is that within a short time, problems began to come. After the death of Jeroboam, we find that it was really a matter of just a few years, a matter of about 20 years, that about a 40-year period, that just saw the complete collapse. Israel went from its height to captivity in the lifespan of a generation, which is not unique. There are certainly even parallels to our time. We find that at the end, toward the history of Israel, is recorded here in 2 Kings 15, we find that there was a rapid succession of kings. There was a lot of political instability. The nation became virtually paralyzed. There was an absence of strong leadership. It was just a turnover, one after another. A time of instability. And of course, the Assyrians came in and originally put the land under tribute, exacted taxes, and eventually came in and laid waste to Samaria, took Israel into captivity, and ultimately put an end to the nation of northern Israel, the northern 10 tribes. Now, here we have this story in 2 Kings 15 and 16. I'd like to call your attention to 2 Kings 17. We have here the story of the conclusion of the history of the northern 10 tribes. In verse 6 of 2 Kings 17, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria. He carried Israel away into Assyria. He placed them in Halah and in Habar by the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. And so it was that the children of Israel had sinned. And God brought an adversary against them. We're told in verse 10, they set them up images and groves in every high hill and under every green tree. We're told that they would not listen, in verse 14, to God's servants. They rejected His statutes, verse 15, His covenant that He made with their fathers. Verse 16, they left all of the commandment of the eternal, their God. They made the molten images, 2 calves, and made a grove. They worshipped all the host of heaven, and they served Baal. So they did everything God told them not to do. Verse 18, God was angry. He removed them out of His sight, and there was none left but the tribe of Judah only. See, we're told that, verse 21, God rent Israel from the house of David. They made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord, made them sin a great sin. The children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They departed not from them until the Lord removed Israel out of His sight. Israel was carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. Right on down to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the Old Testament canon was completed, northern Israel was still carried away. They had been settled in the land of Assyria specifically, they were settled in the cities of the Medes by the river Gozan. Now, if you want to check a map, you will find that that is an area between the Black and the Caspian Sea. That is an area between the Black and the Caspian Sea, down toward the southern shore of the Black Sea. That is way up at the top of the away from of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Babylon is down at the bottom, right near the Persian Gulf. The Jews, 150 years later, were taken to Babylon. They were not taken up to the cities of the Medes, which was a totally different empire. The Israelites were taken to not to Babylon, but they were taken by the Assyrians and settled in the cities of the Medes, up by the river Gozan. In other words, up there on the southern shore of the Black Sea. It should not come as a surprise that it is from the southern shore of the Black Sea that we read in history that the Celtic peoples invaded Europe, originating from the southern shore of the Black Sea. And basically in two waves. One around 700 BC, which was the initial wave right after the captivity, and the main wave was almost 400 years later. And there is a specific prophecy of that. We'll get into that at a little later time. But when Alexander the Great overthrew the empire of the Medes and the Persians in 331, that freed the Israelites who had been taken captive. And that is when the main Celtic invasion of Europe took place around 330 BC. 330 to 300 BC. That's when they swarmed across the Black Sea and into Europe. Now, it was prophesied in the book of Ezekiel that Israel would be in captivity 390 years. Well, from the fall of Samaria in 721 until Alexander conquered the Medes and the Persians in 331 was exactly 390 years. In exactly 390 years, when Alexander conquered them, the Israelites were freed. They crossed the Black Sea and invaded Europe, and that's when, if you read your history, that's when the Celts came into Europe, and that's where they came from. Very easy to trace historically. Now, notice here that God removed them. Now, He brought in, when the king of Assyria, verse 24 of 2 Kings 17, brought men from Babylon, and from Cutha, and Ava, and Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. So he brought in these Babylonians and settled them in the areas where the northern Israelites had been deported from. Then, these Babylonians decided that they needed some instruction in the God of the land, because in the intervening time between the time that the land had lain unpopulated, wild animals, of course, had multiplied greatly. They came in being superstitious. They decided that what they needed was some instructions about the God of the land. So the king, verse 27, the king of Assyria, told them to carry back one of the priests whom they had brought from there, and he would teach them the manner of the God of the land. Now, don't you know that he was going to do a good job of teaching them God's truth? What was this priest? Well, he was one of the ones that, he was one of the lowest of the people that had been the priest of the high places, priest of the golden calf. He had been one of the ones that Jeroboam had put in office. So what was he going to teach them? He was going to teach them the same kind of paganism that Israel had been having. Only the difference was that they used God's name. See, they used the name of the God of Israel. When they built this golden calf and they did all these things, they paid lip service to the God of Israel, to Yahweh, but they practiced all these pagan things. Notice what it says. See, we're told in verse 28 that one of these priests came back and he taught them how they ought to fear the Lord. And don't you know he did a good job? Verse 29, howbeit every nation made gods of their own, and they put them in the houses of the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in their cities. And it mentions all the different ones. Verse 32, so they feared the eternal, and made unto themselves of the lowest of them priests of the high places. So evidently the priests showed them where they're supposed to get their priests. He made these priests which sacrificed to them. Verse 33, they feared the eternal and served their own gods, after the manner of the nations whom they carried away from thence. Unto this day they do after the former manners. They don't fear the eternal, neither do they after his statutes or judgments or ordinances which he commanded. Verse 41, so these nations feared the eternal and served their graven images, both their children and their children's children, as did their fathers, so do they unto this day. The time of Ezra and Nehemiah, that's what they had to say about the Samaritans. See, this is the origin of the Samaritans. When the northern Israelites were taken into captivity, then the Assyrians moved Babylonians in and settled them in that area. Brought back one of the Israelite priests, and so now they had a hodgepodge religion. They kept their old pagan Babylonian religion with all their idols, but now they attached God's name to it. That was what the Samaritans were doing. They paid lip service to God and the Bible, but they worshiped their same old idols, same old paganism. Now, does that ring a familiar bell? Are you familiar with any particular religion that has made quite a practice of preserving whatever pagan tradition people were already doing and just attaching a new name to it? Attaching a good Bible name to it? Take, for example, down in Mexico, the great shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is the great shrine in Mexico. That's quite a famous Catholic shrine. Well, if you'll study the history of Mexico, you find out that shrine had been around for a long time, way antedates the coming of the Spaniards. It had been the shrine to the goddess worshipped by the Aztecs. And so when the Spaniards came in, and the priests, they decided, sprinkle a little water and everybody became Catholic. They decided, well, they all liked this shrine, see, and they were all used to coming here and worshiping this goddess. That's fine. You can keep on doing exactly the same thing at the same place, use the same old stuff. Now it's not what it used to be. Now it's Our Lady of Guadalupe. We'll sprinkle a little water, and all of a sudden she's got a new name. Same old thing. When you come into the New Testament, you read of the animosity of the Jews and the Samaritans. Here's where it came from. This is why the Jews didn't like the Samaritans, because they knew what the Samaritans were. You remember what Christ told the woman at the well in Samaria? He told her, he said, you Samaritans, worship you know not what. We Jews, know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. You can go back and read it there in John chapter 4. You see, Christ settled the argument. Where do you look? Who preserved the truth? Well, the Samaritans didn't. The Jews did. They preserved the Old Testament, and they preserved the truth. But then in Acts 8, we read of one Simon, known in history as Simon Magus, Simon the magician, Simon the sorcerer, who was the chief religious official of the Samaritans, to whom they all gave heed. And in reality, what you find, we'll maybe go into a Bible study on it one time, but just as the Jews had been dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world, and the Jewish community served as the nucleus around which the true church of God was built, even in the Gentile cities. Because it was converted Jews who knew the law and had access to the Scriptures that served as the nucleus of the church, and the Gentiles were added in around it. And because this is where there was access to the knowledge of the truth of the Scriptures. And we find that. Even Paul, who was the apostle to the Gentiles, he came in and to the Jew first and then to the Gentiles. Because by having a stable core of people who were familiar with the law as the first ones in the church, then it was much simpler when others, newer, came out of other backgrounds, were added in. There were already people in the church. The membership in the church were people who were culturally attuned to the Bible and to the principles of the law. And other new members coming in acclimated themselves to it. That was the logical way to do it, and that's the way God did it. There was another church that had its beginnings a couple of years later, that had its beginnings in Samaria with one Simon the sorcerer. And interestingly enough, there had been, as a result of some of the conquests of Alexander the Great, there had been also a limited dispersion of the Samaritans. There were major Samaritan colonies in two areas: Rome, Italy, and Alexandria, Egypt. And these colonies, these centers in Rome and Alexandria, became the center of the church that Simon the magician, Simon the sorcerer, sought to build with himself as the head. That gets into another story, but the origin and some very crucial, 2 Kings 17 is a critical chapter, very important information that is preserved there. We see, of course, as we come on down, let's notice a little bit of Hezekiah in 2 Kings 18. We find Hezekiah was the king. He did what was right in verse 3. Hezekiah was a very zealous man. Now let's turn back to 2 Chronicles chapter 29. Get a little insight into something that occurred right at the time of the fall of northern Israel. After the Assyrians had come in and had successfully invaded, in 2 Chronicles 29, we find when Hezekiah became king of Judah, there was a time of great reform. He repaired the temple, had the scriptures being preached. Now notice what he did in 2 Chronicles 30, verse 1. He sent to all Israel and Judah. Now he was only king of Judah, but he sent a letter to all Israel and Judah. And he wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem to keep the Passover. And he established a decree, verse 5, made proclamation throughout all Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, that they should come and keep the Passover to the Lord God of Israel at Jerusalem. They had not done of a long time in such sort as it was written. So he sent these messengers throughout all Israel and Judah, and he told them, notice in the end of verse 6, "You children of Israel, turn again to the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and He will return to the remnant of you that are escaped out of the hand of the kings of Assyria. Be not like your fathers and like your brethren." Verse 9, "If you turn again unto the Eternal, your brethren and your children shall find compassion before them that lead them captive, and they will come again into this land." So, verse 10, the post passed from city to city. Throughout Ephraim and Manasseh and Zebulun, they were laughed to scorn and mocked. There were a handful, a few, from Asher and Manasseh and Zebulun that humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. There were a handful who came down there, but basically Hezekiah's messengers were laughed at and scorned. There was the final warning and witness to Israel. Repent. It was in the context of coming to observe God's festivals. Come up to Jerusalem to observe God's festivals. Repent, and God will be merciful. They did not respond, and the Assyrian army came in and took them all captive. This was we find is in chapter 31 that Hezekiah sent them out to break down the idols. In verse 1, throughout all the land, he made provision in verse 4 for the Levites that they would be encouraged in the law of God. The people began to tithe again in verse 5. We find that in verse 7, in the third month, they began to lay the foundation of the heaps. In other words, at Pentecost, they began bringing their tithes in. And it was finished by the 7th month, by the Feast of Tabernacles, when the final harvest was finished. There was, revival that took place. When real revival took place, the people started obeying God. They started keeping the festivals, they started tithing, they started doing the things that people do when they're repentant. Hezekiah, we're told in verse 20, did what was good and right before God in every work that he began in the service of the house of God and in the law and in the commandments to seek his God. He did it with all his heart, and he prospered. So God was very pleased with Hezekiah. We see this account. We've already commented on where the tribes of northern Israel were taken in captivity. They were taken to the cities of the Medes, primarily between the areas between the Black and the Caspian Sea. Babylonians were brought in to the former land of Israel, were known as Samaritans, taking their name from the capital city there. We're told about the religion of the Samaritans. It was the same old Babylonian mystery religion that they had been following all along, but now they added a new ingredient. They began to call it all by the name of the true God. One of the northern Israel priests was brought back to Samaria to teach them the manner of the God of the land. So Jeroboam's approach to religion was also preserved. We've seen that. In terms of Hezekiah, let's notice in 2 Kings 18. In 2 Kings 18, verse 5, notice what we're told, God's analysis of Hezekiah. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him, for he clave to the Lord, and he departed not from following him. He kept his commandments, which the Eternal commanded Moses. Hezekiah was a very faithful, righteous man. He obeyed God. He did what God said, and he did it with his whole heart. There's no king of Judah that excelled him in that. What did he do when the Assyrians invaded? We get an example here of how he handled problems. In chapter 19, we're given where the kings of Assyria came in and said, in effect, look, they told what they wanted the Jews to do. See, they deported Israel. Now they were going to come in and deport Judah. In 2 Kings 18:31, they said, "Hearken not to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, you make an agreement with me, and you'll come out to me, and then you'll eat every man of his own vine and every one of his own fig tree. You'll drink waters out of your own cistern." So they were promising the Millennium German style. The Assyrians were going to come in. They said, now look, we'll come, verse 32, and take you away to a land like your own. We'll take you to a nice place. We're going to deport you to these concentration camps, but they're going to be nice places, and you will like it. Just come on out of your city, open the gates, and come on out nicely, and we will load you in the cattle cars, and we will transport you to these nice places that we have, and everybody will live happily ever after. Now, why don't you nice Jews come on out? So this was the story. History, doesn't change a whole lot. Once you've read it, you just repeat the same thing, nothing new under the sun. So the solution was Hezekiah came in to God. And he prayed before God. Verse 14, Hezekiah received a letter from the hand of the messengers that demanded his surrender. And he took it to the house of the Lord and he spread it before the Lord. He just spread the letter out, and then he said, look, God, you can read. You see what they say. Look at this. Look at what these Assyrians are saying. I beseech you, save us out of their hand. So God says, I'm going to deliver you. In verse 34 of 2 Kings 19, I'm going to defend this city for my sake and for my servant David's sake. So that night the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. When they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. Now the dead corpses didn't rise up and find out they were dead, but whoever was left rose up and found out that, one angel, one army. Very simple. God sent, wasn't hard at all. Hezekiah went to God with the problem. He went to God and he really spread out his problem before God. And so we find in verse 36 that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. You better believe he departed and went and returned. When he got up the next morning and found 185,000 people dead, he was the only one left alive in his whole army. You better believe he departed and went and returned. I bet he hopped the first horse and took off as fast as he could get. He didn't stay around to investigate the cause of death. All he did was load it up and move it out as fast as he could get there. I suspect that anybody in a similar circumstance would have also departed and went and returned very quickly. Now, Hezekiah became very critically ill. And again, he went to God. And God healed him, intervened. You hear the story in 2 Kings 20. When Hezekiah died, we're told in chapter 21 that his son Manasseh became king. And Manasseh was the opposite of his father. Did everything that he could. In fact, he was the most wicked king that ever ruled Judah. And Manasseh is described here in all of his sins, here in 2 Kings 21. And because of the sins of Manasseh, all of Judah was ultimately to be taken into captivity. That's what God says in verse 12 of 2 Kings 21. I'm going to bring such evil on Judah and Jerusalem that whoever hears it, both of his ears are going to tingle. I'm going to wipe Jerusalem, verse 13, as a man wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. So that's pretty clean. God says, I am going to clean house. I have put up with this until I am sick and tired of it. Well, Manasseh died, and his son Ammon ruled briefly, and then Josiah, who was 8 years old when he began to reign, chapter 22, verse 1. Josiah did what was right in the sight of the Lord. When Josiah was 16, he began to seek God, and by the time he was 20, he, with all the zeal of youth, was really inaugurating a real house cleaning. He cleaned the temple, he purged Jerusalem of idols, and Judah of idols. He went all the way out. Everything he could find that smacked of idolatry, he burned it and ground it to powder. Josiah was a young man, and he had all of the zeal of youth. He was very, very zealous and was directly responsible. He was the only thing that stood between Judah and going into captivity. God had respect to Josiah and Josiah's repentance, and he said, all right, I've said what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to do anything as long as Josiah is alive. Because he is seeking me with his whole heart, his attitude, his actions are such that I appreciate, and I will spare and protect the nation throughout his life. You better believe that everybody prayed, long live the king, and meant it. Because the only thing that stood between the nation and destruction was King Josiah. God said, this is the only thing good about the whole place, and as long as he's king, I'll spare the nation, but when he's gone, look out. Well, we find that story, the parallel in 2 Chronicles 34, as it goes through. 2 Chronicles 35, the great Passover that Josiah kept. We're told in 2 Chronicles 35:17, the children of Israel that were present kept the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread. Verse 18, there was no Passover like that kept in Israel from the days of Samuel the prophet. You realize how long that has been? That has been over 500 years. Over 500 years. There hadn't been anything as all out as what Josiah did. Now, the difference between Josiah's Passover and the great Passover of Hezekiah had to be celebrated at the time of the second Passover, rather than at the proper date in the first month, because of ceremonial uncleanness. So Josiah's Passover excelled Hezekiah's in that sense, that it was more totally kept exactly the way God said it ought to be done. And then Josiah died, and we're told in verse 24, the latter part of the verse, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. And Jeremiah lamented for Josiah, and all the singing men and singing women spoke of Josiah in their lamentations to this day, and made them an ordinance in Israel, and they are written in the Lamentations. Now you read some of the commentators and some of the commentaries, and they say, we wonder what this was. Well, now, if you go back in your Bible, the book that comes right after the book of Jeremiah, a little short book, one we don't go to very often, stuck in there between Jeremiah and Ezekiel, is a book called The Lamentations of Jeremiah. Now, where do you think it says in verse 25, Jeremiah lamented for Josiah, and all the singing men and singing women spoke of Josiah in their lamentations to this day. They made them an ordinance in Israel. They're written in the Lamentations. So where do you think they are? Well, that's what the book of Lamentations is. Very obvious. That's where it came from. It was the lament that Jeremiah wrote was added to the Bible. It was made an ordinance in Israel and continued to be used. It is the book that is read. The Jews read that book every year on the 9th of Ab, which is Ab is the 5th month of the Hebrew calendar. Comes approximately July, August. The 9th day of Ab is a fast day that the Jews observe in commemoration of the destruction of the temple. Interestingly enough, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple on the 9th of Ab, and centuries later, when Titus and the Romans burned it in 70 A.D., they did it on exactly the same day. So now they had two reasons to lament on the fast of Ab, on the 9th of Ab. They read the book of Lamentations. Lamentations was a lament written at the death of Josiah that looked forward to the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah that was going to come. And the destruction that came on Judah and Jerusalem was a type of the great tribulation that will be the worst time of tribulation that ever comes. So the book of Lamentations, which we will go through at a later time in the Bible study, is a prophecy of the great tribulation. It was written by Jeremiah at the occasion of Josiah's death, because Josiah's death signaled the onset of what really amounted to the tribulation for Judah and Jerusalem, the destruction of the nation and the captivity. The highlight of Josiah's reign, of course, was the great Passover recorded there in 2 Chronicles 35. This, of course, is the end of the story. Let's just notice in 2 Kings 25 that after Josiah's death, chapter 24 shows that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came in, made Judah a vassal state, and in chapter 25 he invaded and killed King Zedekiah, or killed the sons of Zedekiah, and took Zedekiah captive and took the Jews into captivity. The 2 Kings chapter 25, Nebuchadnezzar invaded, he conquered Judah, he burned Jerusalem and the temple, and he carried the Jews into captivity to Babylon. So we find that that destruction that took place, that finally by about 587 B.C., Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews were in captivity. So we find the result of the nation having departed from God. Now hopefully this has given us somewhat of an overview. We're going to, next Bible study, if I could get some help in passing out questions. When the nation was taken into captivity, Israel, of course, had been transported around 721 B.C. About 120 years later, 604, Nebuchadnezzar invaded, and Judah was a vassal state until finally they were destroyed and taken captive, with Jerusalem destroyed in 587. That brings us to the conclusion, you see, of Kings and Chronicles. We will pick up the story in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which we will go through next Bible study, which will give us the overview of what happened during the Babylonian captivity, the return of the Jews from Babylon back to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel, the rebuilding of the temple, the time of restoration that took place, and the conclusion of the Old Testament period. The Bible study following, we will have a study that will cover the times between the Testaments. We'll go into the story of what happened between the end of the book of Nehemiah and the beginning of the book of Matthew. So we will run that historic sequence through, and I think hopefully this series of Bible studies has enabled you to get a little more of an overview of the history of the Old Testament. But again, over and over, I would call your attention to the fact that these things are written down for our admonition. You know, we need to study the history that is recorded in the Bible in order to get a God's eye view of life and of everything. The Bible gives us a story of what man did and didn't do from God's perspective. You know, any author writes a book from his own vantage point. We're all familiar with that. If you read the history of anything, any event, any war, depending on where you read it, you're going to get the story differently. The story that we study of World War II is a little different than what they study in Japan or Germany. For years, the story of the events surrounding the war between the states was taught differently in Louisiana than it was taught in Massachusetts. That's just the way it is. Some of you, who have been in other areas of the country, it's just simply a matter that people tell a story from their own perspective. Now, every author has his axe to grind, and we read a book and we know it's not entirely accurate. It's kind of from that author's viewpoint. Well, this is a book that is entirely accurate because it's written from the only accurate viewpoint there is. That's God's point of view. We need to study the Bible in order to understand God's point of view. We grow up in a society where we're affected by society's point of view on any number of subjects. Throughout this study of the Old Testament, the historical characters, one of the ways God teaches us, in some cases it's by direct command. Thou shalt not. But most of the teaching of the Bible is not direct command, thou shalt not. Most of the teaching of the Bible is by example, by illustration, by principle that is illustrated throughout the story. We need to study the Bible from that standpoint. That's what Paul told us in the New Testament. These things are written down for our admonition. They're examples for us, written down for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age are come. As we study the story of these individuals, what they did, what they didn't do, we try to study it from a standpoint of finding out what God is pleased with, what God is displeased with, what certain attributes, what certain actions, what certain attitudes caused, what were the good results, what were the bad results, what were the strengths and weaknesses of all of these individuals. As we study it from that standpoint, it's not a matter of simply dead history. It's a matter of reading of real people who went through real things. And one of the real crucial reasons it's recorded for us. What have we found as we've gone through over and over? We're going to find it next time with Ezra and Nehemiah. We find that God's people, time after time, century after century, have confronted many of the same problems, same troubles, same temptations. Satan has sought to undermine and thwart things the same way over and over and over again. You know, if we study the Bible from that perspective, there's nothing new that will ever happen. Any problem, anything that comes up, there is precedent for it that you can find. And you look to see how did God want it handled. You know, how should the people have handled it? How did those who were righteous and faithful to God, how did they handle it? We study it from that perspective so that if and when we ever find ourselves in a similar situation, we will already know how to react and respond. You know, it's an important way to study the Bible. Too many times we study it and it just is kind of a story and people go through and they get bogged down in all the begats and all the kings and all of this and they miss the overview. It's there so that we can learn by the examples of others and not have to make all the same mistakes. You know, the lesson of history, of course, is that very few ever learn anything from history. But we have the opportunity. God has given it to us, provided it for us. What we are going through and will go through between now and the end of the age, there are parallels all through the Scriptures. We have to study the Scriptures to find those parallels and to apply them in a right way. Well, hopefully we have found some information of value. As we've gone through this survey of the Old Testament, we will conclude it with the next couple of studies. Good night.